Well, my childhood growing up in Brooklyn um, is, well, every neighborhood in Brooklyn is different from another neighborhood. Sometimes religiously, sometimes ethnically. But I would always tell people now, I said, if you want to experience New York City, get on a subway, go 4 or 5 stops, get off, and walk through that neighborhood. If it's lunchtime, have some of the food from that neighborhood, because the ethnicity of Brooklyn and New York City in general is the United Nations. My block right here, right now we live in Flatlands, and my block is the United Nations. We're Jewish. There's another Jewish household on the block. My next door neighbor on this side, Jamaican. The driveway we share with our neighbor here, they're Pakistani. We have Haitian, Jamaican, Puerto Rican, Irish Catholic. Let's see. And there are a young Chinese couple bought a house 2 doors down about 3 years ago. So we are literally the United Nations on this block. The neighbors on our block have changed quite a bit since we moved in. We moved here in 1986. That's 1986. That's 34 years ago. And there were many more white families on the block that have either passed away or moved. And they've been replaced by black families, Haitian, Jamaican, Trinidadian, by Muslims, Pakistani, Chinese, I mentioned a minute ago, and Puerto Rican. So it is, most of the neighbors know each other, and it's a really a very nice block. The neighborhood in general, compared to when we moved in, as far as crime is concerned, there's very little. We're very thankful that we are blessed that we've been lucky. Once in a blue moon, you'll hear a car being stolen, but you'll find that in any area of the city. But that has not happened here recently. It's primarily 1 family and 2 family homes, primarily. A couple of apartment houses scattered around. There are no high-rise developments within the vicinity of where we live right here. And we'd like it to stay that way. Developers are always looking to change neighborhoods. We would not like to see that. Brooklyn in general has changed dramatically, especially if you go downtown Brooklyn. Downtown Brooklyn looks almost now like Midtown Manhattan. We don't want Brooklyn to become Manhattanized. Downtown Brooklyn is one thing, because you have the courthouses are there, Brooklyn Borough Hall is there, colleges you have down there as well. You have Long Island University, St. Francis. I know I'm skipping a couple, but there are other colleges down there as well. But downtown Brooklyn looks 100% different than it did when I was growing up in Brooklyn, back in the 1950s and 60s. As a historian, studying and learning about the history of the borough of Brooklyn, which was a city at one time. You had the city of New York, you had the city of Brooklyn. Williamsburg was a city for a very short time, for about 4 years, and then it was gathered in by the city of Brooklyn in 1855. Williamsburg, Bushwick, and Greenpoint became part of the city of Brooklyn in 1855. And then gradually in the 1890s, the other towns and villages were incorporated into the city of Brooklyn, 1 or 2 at a time. And by 1896, all of Kings County became the city of Brooklyn until January 1st, 1898, when all the 5 counties became the 5 boroughs of New York City. And even today, a lot of us call that the mistake of 98, because I think a lot of people in Brooklyn at that time wanted to remain a separate city. But learning the history of Brooklyn, giving tours for now over 30 years of some of the historic neighborhoods in Brooklyn, giving lectures for over 30 years on Brooklyn's history, using, I have about 3,000 slides of old Brooklyn street scenes, which I photographed from my postcards from early 20th century Brooklyn, from my photographs that I have, documents that I have, the maps that I've collected. I've learned how Brooklyn became the way it is, the way it was, and the way it is today. If we go back to the 1800s, a good part of Brooklyn was farmland. You had villages and towns scattered around. When the Dutch arrived in the 1600s, they started purchasing, when I say purchasing, no land was purchased with money because they were buying land from the local Indians, primarily the Canarsie Indians here in Brooklyn. There were roughly 200 separate land deals. Goods and services were traded for the purchase of the land. The Indians had no idea what land ownership was. To them, the land was open. And right away, the Dutch started cutting down trees to build homes and so on, which they needed shelter. Of course, Brooklyn was forested, and then it became farmland. And they started to build fences around their homes. And the Indians had no idea what fences were. And some of these fences blocked, eventually, some of the Indians from getting to their hunting grounds. And this led to a lot of difficulties and fighting. One of the Dutch governors, Willem Kieft, was notorious in starting wars with the Indians. So that was the very beginning of how land changed. Skipping the 1700s, now let's move into the 1800s. Brooklyn was still a good much farmland. You had the town of Flatbush, the town of Bushwick. By the middle 1800s, Williamsburg became a city because along the waterfront of the East River, you had the beer breweries, and the German immigrants brought their expertise in beer brewing. So you have in Bushwick, Williamsburg, and Greenpoint, you had major industry and very little farming at that time in that area. And you had in Brooklyn, not just along the waterfront, but in Brooklyn in general, 45 beer breweries by the turn of the century. And Brooklyn was the beer capital of the United States at that time. And when the Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, that started the influx of a population explosion starting in Brooklyn. In 1903, 20 years later, the Williamsburg Bridge opened. And that opened up the overcrowded and congested Lower Manhattan, with the Lower East Side. Now people were able to come into Brooklyn with their own horses and wagons, with their goods, with their furniture, starting to buy up land that developers started to buy up the farmland. Because the Brooklyn Bridge, and a lot of people don't know this, had trolleys and trains on it originally. In fact, there's a picture behind me that shows one of the trains on the Brooklyn Bridge in 1900. The Williamsburg Bridge had trains. And in 1909, the Manhattan Bridge opened, connecting, and these three East River bridges connected the city of New York, Manhattan, to the city of Brooklyn on the other side. And this allowed people to travel from one borough, because in 1898, the 5 counties became the 5 boroughs of New York City. Then the developers came in after the Brooklyn Bridge opened and the Williamsburg Bridge opened and started buying up a lot of the farmland and building housing tracts, not apartment houses, but housing tracts right along these railroads, which enabled people to buy these homes if they could afford it. And for example, in Flatbush, where you have what's known now as Victorian Flatbush, these homes were selling from 1899 to about 1915. That's when they were built. For $6,500 to about $12,000, $13,000. That's what they were selling for. Today, these are landmark communities. The houses, 99% of them are still there. Movies are made there. TV shows are filmed there. You have the B and the Q train that goes right through the area, which was originally the Brooklyn, Flatbush, and Coney Island Railroad, a steam line that ran on the street. I have photographs that show that, all right? And as the area started to be built up with these magnificent homes, with lawyers and doctors and Wall Street people buying these homes for these ridiculous prices of $8,000, $9,000. Today, these homes are $1 million, $2 million, maybe $3 million. And this started the neighborhoods changing. And as the decades went on, neighborhoods changed. Apartment houses started being built, especially after World War II, as a lot of the soldiers started coming back from the war and more housing was needed. Housing projects were built. Apartment houses started to line Ocean Avenue, where there once were mansions. Some of them still exist, these mansions, in Flatbush. Some of them are still there, but most of them were gone. And neighborhoods started to change. In the 1960s, a lot of the senior members, I'm using Flatbush right now, a lot of senior members of the community in the apartment houses started to either pass away or starting moving to the suburbs. Now, in the 1940s, the suburbs started because developers like Mr. Levitt started to build Levittown, Long Island. He also built Levittown, Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia. And I remember as a kid in the 1950s, looking at the newspapers, especially the sports pages, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and seeing ads for houses in Levittown, Pennsylvania for like $4,800, $5,000. Come out to the greener pastures, leave the city. Well, people started leaving. And a lot of the apartment houses started to lose a lot of their population. So a lot of the owners of the apartment houses started to rent to a lot of the minorities that are starting moving into the area. And this started the neighborhoods to change demographically. The neighborhoods change. And since the 1980s, a lot of the neighborhoods have changed demographically, and you might even say geographically, with the kind of housing. A lot of, let's start with Williamsburg. Now, Williamsburg is a community on the northern part of Brooklyn, not far from Manhattan. I think it's maybe 1, 2, or 3 stops from Manhattan on the subway. And Williamsburg, as older people remember it, was a very large Orthodox Hasidic Jewish community. Also, it had a large Hispanic community. There was an Italian part of Williamsburg as well. But things have changed. It still is a very large Orthodox Hasidic Jewish community today. But it has diminished as a Hispanic community, although some is still there. Very little Italian, but some of it is still there. All right. But what has happened is in the 1980s, the Greenwich Village area of Manhattan, where you had a lot of artists, the real estate in Manhattan was, as they say in Brooklyn, forget about it.
Forget about it. A response used to another person's statement meaning unbelievable or unreal or extraordinary.
Forget about it. All right? The prices were going way, way up. And a lot of these artists had trouble financing and living in Greenwich Village. So they started coming across the river to Williamsburg and started to rent and to buy apartments. Well, developers saw this, and they started to buying up a lot of the old housing stock that was not landmarked, and started to tear them down and started to build a lot of high rises, which you did not have in Williamsburg back in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. And you have these very high floor condos, co-ops starting to be built, and rentals, and the prices started to go up. And these artists that started to come into Williamsburg because it was cheaper, now it wasn't that cheap. So what happened as time went on, some of them started to move from Williamsburg into East Williamsburg. And what happened there? The prices started going up, high rises started going up, developers started to start higher prices, and the next community over was Bushwick. And now Bushwick, which looked like a war zone in 1977, after the blackout of 1977, Bushwick was decimated. Block after block looked like a city in Europe during the bombings during World War II. That's what it literally looked like. And now Bushwick is thriving. You have art galleries, you have boutiques, restaurants. So this is what's happening. This is the gentrification of neighborhoods. Not just Brooklyn, this is all over the 5 boroughs of New York City. It's happening. Gentrification is good, but on the other hand, it's not so good, because a lot of the people who have lived there for a long time cannot afford the high rents that are happening, cannot afford the shops and stores that are moving in. You're getting Starbucks moving in all over. You're getting chain stores moving in all over. And so it's a two-edged sword. It's good for the people who can afford it and move into these places, but not so good for the people who have been living there and now cannot afford and now have to move elsewhere because they can't afford the rents or the prices to buy.